So I'm going to talk a little bit about architecture, talk a little bit about Archimate, which is the diagramming tool that I'm using now, and then I'll show what I've done so far. Okay, so here we go. Almost. Okay, so I'm Mead Walker, and I'm going to talk about architecture components, diagramming what I have today, and touch on what we can do next. So architecture descriptions are formal descriptions of an information system. They define its components, aka building blocks, provide a plan from which products can be procured and applications developed, and they enable you to manage your investments in information technology and in people, materials, many things. So when we create an architecture, it's a plan. It's a plan of what we want and what we have. And it's also a plan that shows us how to get from here to there. And it turns out that diagramming what you want is the relatively easy part, and showing the pathway from where you are to where you go is considerably more difficult. But it's also what you actually have to do. And when we build our architecture, we want to include the current function and show how that's going to be managed. And we also want to leave room for where we want to go. And I think that's one of the criteria that we should use looking at the material we developed for RHEA, is to the extent to which it supports both of those. So our architecture is going to show what our new components are and where they fit in. It's going to define the data structures to fit those current needs and to support the ones we anticipate. And it's going to show how technology and resource constraints dictate what we can do now and what we need to work on going forward. All this is a little ideal, and when you see what we have, you'll see that it does some of these things and doesn't do others. So, in terms of using the architecture, it's a tool for design, and it's also a tool for communication. Going in, when I started working on this project, I was thinking mostly of creating a tool that then will be used as the basis for design. Coming out, I'm seeing it used perhaps more as a tool for communicating what we did. And we have an interesting situation where our desire to have a design and then to follow that design is sometimes in conflict with our desire to get things done now based on the things we know we need and that we came in the door knowing we need. So far, what I've done is I've reproduced the high-level vision of the entire RHEA project. I've modeled the projects we've worked on in 2010, 2011, and that we're still working on today, showing the primary components of those projects and the relationships between them. And I've taken a stab at defining what I see as the general information structures for some of our components, most notably the facility registry, which I'll show today, and the data warehouse, which I won't. So what's Archimate? Archimate's a language for representing architectures. It looks like UML, but its exponents say that it's simpler. Could be true. Its developers feel it's more intuitive than other modeling styles, and that actually could be true too. It's the style that Chris suggested, and I've converted my previous diagrams to it. And another claim they make is that service-oriented architecture notions are pretty much inherent in the way it's put together. And that's pretty definitely true. So here are some of the shapes from Archimate that I use. I'm not going to go through them. I'll just talk about them in terms of the actual diagram. And here are some of its relationships. So if you end up with a copy of this, you can use these two slides as a reference. So here is the business architecture that we projected for Rwanda. And we said there's going to be a national system. And I'm defining this in Archimate terms as a service. And that system has component services, which are the registries that we know and love. The client registry, facility registry, provider, practitioner registry, terminology service, and we also have the shared health record, and in our picture, we haven't talked about much as a data warehouse. Those services are access to an interface, which we call our information layer. Who accesses it? Well, we have roles for ongoing testing and imaging, human resources management, insurance, supply chain, community health support, primary health support, secondary and tertiary health support. And in the work that we've done so far, we've noted that primary health support is tended to be supported by a component known as OpenMRS, and community health workers are supported by a component known as Rapid SMS. So this is what I thought the RHEA business architecture looked like. It draws very heavily on the e-health planning work that Richard Kakuba did and others over time. But I would hope that people will take a look at it and tell me all that's wrong with it. So, by the way, this diagram comes from a tool known as Enterprise Architect. Behind the different pieces of the diagram, you're going to find descriptions. So here's a description of a provider practitioner registry. It's supposed to be capable of managing identity and related information for healthcare providers, also known as practitioners, and it includes various bits of information, can be used as a reference file. So for those of you that consume these models, I just suggest as a quality measure, if there's more than a diagram, and if there's descriptions of the things in the diagram, that's a good feature. So let's drill down to current projects. So we're working on maternal and child health support. We're working on facility registry support. We plan to be working on provider registry support. This slide's a little out of date. It should have said terminology server instead of provider registry, because I think that's the next item on our agenda. So I'll show you two diagrams to suggest what child and maternal health support means to us. And this is the one that says we need to be able to request summary information. So if someone appears at a health clinic, the health clinic needs to discover information about them, whether it be their most recent encounters at other locations, or whether it be summary information. And what the diagram is saying is there is a function to manage a request for a clinical summary. Using that function is activated by some event called request clinical summary, and it involves capturing an information structure called query for clinical summary. And in this function we have various component functions, starting with verifying facility, verifying healthcare professional, verifying the client ID, calling the information for the clinical summary, formatting a response, and sending it out. And it turns out that to carry out these functions, for example, to verify the client ID, requires using an interface that is supported by some function called managed client information that's supported by a component called a client registry. As we've implemented this function, most of this part is supported by something we call the interoperability layer, and then the interoperability layer calls out to the shared health record to pull back the data, and then assemble the message. But really, this is mostly supported by our interoperability layer, which perhaps ought to be listed as a component on this diagram. We have a very similar looking function which is used to record an encounter. So when someone comes in at the end of the encounter, we need to send that information for the encounter up to the shared health record. Processing it involves the same validations to verify that you are a facility, the patient was managed by an actual healthcare provider, and that the patient actually is a person recognized in the client registry. If they're not, then the client registry needs to be updated. So we also have discussed a function to do maternal and child alerts. So the diagram is saying that there's some function called managing alerts, and it's triggered by an event called time to manage alerts. That really boils down to either the clock ticked and you were supposed to check to see if there was someone that you had to send out an alert for, or you received a message about somebody which made the application need to search its database and see whether it needed to do something. So that involves a function, the query, to see if you need to do an alert, which is a query against the shared health record, retrieving the alert data, formatting, and then transmission of the message. And the interface is what we're calling a provide alert, ORU. RHEA just being a message identifier from HL7 saying that this is going to be a collection of observations. So that is the, I guess what our committee would call the business perspective on Rwanda's RHEA project. Here, there's also a need to define the information, and the approach I took was to look at the individual repositories and to model their information repository by repository. So here's a suggestion of what the information for the facility registry would look like. And I took a position that I would go through the existing data elements, identify those that I thought ought to be abstracted, and abstract those out in a more generic way, and some others I didn't abstract. So you can see a facility has a location in a particular cell, which is a geographic location. It has a physical location. It has a certain collection of capabilities, which are things like numbers of ambulances, number of working refrigerators, and so on. It has the ability to marshal a certain number of resources. It's associated with certain persons and is associated with certain catchment locations, and it may have component facilities. So there's some hidden agendas here I'm looking forward. Namely, I'm expecting over time the notion of facility to grow to include departments within facilities, and I'm also expecting over time the facility data to be used to manage scheduling and referrals. So what's been left out? I don't have a full set of registry data models, and one wonders, should there be something that would be essentially a collection of the registry models, which you could think of as a RHEA overall logical model showing all the data and its relationships. So that's a good thing to have. It's also something that takes work. We are still have work to do on our whole process with this architecture, in that it's been very much me taking the material as I hear what people say they're doing, drawing diagrams, and displaying them occasionally. We need to have the other part of the loop to get feedback on the stuff to allow it to grow. And there's another level below this, which is, you can think of as a technology level, which talks more about, given these things that we need to do, what are our implementation decisions? And that hasn't really been started yet. Thank you.